If prayer is something you do, what does it mean when prayer begins to happen without you? This paradox lies at the heart of Yunus Emre's hidden practice. In most traditions, prayer is understood as an act of intention, something initiated by an individual who seeks connection, forgiveness, or divine response. It is viewed as a dialogue between the human and the divine, between the seeker and the sought. Yet Yunus Emre, the 13th century Anatolian mystic and rational poet, proposed something astonishing. The highest form of prayer is not spoken, performed, or even initiated. It arises when the self that prays disappears. At that point, consciousness itself becomes prayer. In this lecture, we'll examine this paradox through a rational and psychological lens, exploring how the prayer that prays itself reveals a profound transformation in consciousness, one that modern neuroscience and cognitive psychology increasingly recognize as a measurable, lived reality. To understand Yunus Emre's insight, we must first look at what prayer has become in the modern world today. Prayer, or any spiritual practice, is often treated as a performance of faith or a transactional act. One prays to get results, comfort, control, or divine reward. The underlying psychology is clear. It is the self, attempting to negotiate with something greater than itself. From a cognitive perspective, this reinforces what psychologists call egoic agency, the sense that I am the doer, I am the speaker, I am the one who must make this happen. The act of prayer becomes another mental behavior, meant to control outcomes. Research in cognitive dissonance and ritualized behavior supports this observation. When rituals are performed without internal alignment, they no longer reduce anxiety but increase it. The mind repeats words mechanically while the heart remains detached. This creates an inner split between belief and experience, action and awareness. This condition is reflected in the default mode network, the part of the brain active during self-referential thinking. When the DMN dominates, the mind is busy rehearsing identity, narrating stories, and protecting the self-image. Even in moments of devotion, the self is still performing. So the question Yunus Emre forces us to ask is deeply psychological. Can there be prayer without the I who prays? Yunus Emre lived in 13th century Anatolia, an era of deep social and spiritual transformation. His genius was not only poetic but profoundly analytical. He translated the mystical experiences of Sufism into language that reflected a rational psychology of awareness. For Yunus, the act of devotion was not about external motion, but internal transformation. True prayer, he said, begins when the distinction between doing and being collapses. It is not something you perform. It is what happens when awareness becomes still enough to reflect reality as it is. He once wrote, in paraphrase, "When I disappeared, I found my prayer still alive, praying by itself." This is not anti-religious. It is meta-religious, transcending ritual without denying it. He sought not to abolish prayer, but to uncover its inner mechanism, how consciousness itself is moved by the divine rhythm of existence. In modern terms, Yunus anticipated what contemplative neuroscience calls non-dual awareness, the moment when the brain's self-referential circuits quiet down and awareness perceives itself directly, unmediated by identity. Yunus Emre described prayer as a mirror. It reflects who is praying. When you pray from ego, the reflection is ego. When you pray from silence, the reflection is pure awareness. The first transformation in his teaching is the collapse of agency. Most people pray as if they are initiating an act. I want, I need, I must be forgiven. But Yunus points out that the very impulse to pray does not come from the self. It comes through it. The urge to seek the divine is itself a movement of the divine. Modern psychology offers an interesting parallel. In flow states, when a person is deeply absorbed in a task, the sense of I am doing this dissolves. The action continues, often with greater precision and fluidity, but without a sense of self-conscious control. Neuroscientific studies show that during these states, activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, the seat of self-referential thought, significantly decreases. Yunus Emre's description of prayer, that praise itself, mirrors this. It is not the elimination of prayer, but the elimination of the illusion of control. Prayer still happens, but there is no performer. There is only the act, luminous, effortless, complete. When the self disappears, awareness does not vanish. It becomes more coherent, more radiant, more real. In his second insight, Yunus Emre reverses the entire act of prayer. He says, true prayer begins when speaking ends and listening begins. This shift from speech to silence is not about muteness. It is about the transformation of consciousness from output to reception. Modern contemplative psychology calls this receptive awareness, a state where the mind ceases to generate thought and begins to observe experience without resistance. Neuroscience confirms that during such receptive states, auditory and interoceptive networks synchronize. The brain begins to tune into subtle internal signals, heartbeat, breath, rhythm, emotional tone, creating what researchers call heightened interoceptive sensitivity. Yunus describes this as the awakening of the inner ear. The ear that hears, he said, is not of flesh but of heart. In this state, awareness becomes an instrument of resonance, not expression. You are not sending words upward. You are listening to the silent movement of existence itself. From a physiological view, this transition from verbalization to stillness activates the parasympathetic nervous system, reducing arousal and increasing coherence. The system shifts from tension to harmony. The mind stops striving to reach something and instead receives what is already present. Yunus Emre's third insight is perhaps the most radical. The boundary between the one who prays and the one who is prayed to is ultimately illusory. He is not asserting theological equality, but revealing metaphysical symmetry. When the self disappears, what remains is the pure act of consciousness, the awareness in which both subject and object appear. He writes, in essence, you are not the one who prays. You are the prayer itself. Modern research into advanced meditative states describes something remarkably similar. In moments of non-dual awareness, practitioners report the collapse of subject-object distinction. There is no observer separate from the observed. Neuroimaging studies show increased gamma synchrony across brain regions, indicating that normally segregated neural networks have become globally integrated. This is what mystics call unity consciousness. In theological language, it resonates with the Quranic statement, "He is nearer to you than your jugular vein." Yunus Emre's prayer that prays itself is not poetic exaggeration. It is a phenomenological description of what consciousness experiences when it recognizes its own divine continuity. The word surrender often carries a negative connotation. It sounds like losing, like giving up agency. But Yunus Emre uses it differently. For him, surrender is alignment, the mind's recognition of the natural order of reality. when the self stops resisting, consciousness aligns with what already is. In psychological terms, this corresponds to deactivation of resistance circuits in the brain. Studies in acceptance-based therapies, such as ACT and mindfulness-based stress reduction, demonstrate that letting go of control actually enhances emotional regulation and cognitive flexibility. Yunus expresses this transformation beautifully. When I stopped striving to reach you, I found you already present. In modern cognitive language, this is the transition from effortful attention to effortless awareness. The nervous system no longer spends energy defending identity. It reverts to homeostatic balance, the natural state of coherence. Thus, selfless prayer is not mystical escapism. It is psychological efficiency in its purest form, awareness functioning without friction. Let's now look at how this process operates both cognitively and spiritually. Human consciousness functions through identification loops. Thought creates emotion, emotion reinforces identity, and identity sustains thought. When prayer is performed by this loop, I am praying, the self is strengthened. Yunus Emre's method breaks this loop by shifting awareness away from identity. Here's how it unfolds. Silence reduces self-referential thought. The verbal mind quiets, weakening the DMN's dominance. Listening redirects attention inward. Awareness begins to track sensations and presence instead of words. Emotional coherence, gratitude, and humility stabilize neural synchrony. Awareness becomes self-sustaining. Prayer continues, not as an act, but as an ongoing condition of consciousness. Physiologically, this resembles what researchers call heart-brain coherence, where heartbeat and breathing synchronize at around 0.1 Hz. This rhythm corresponds to emotional balance, clarity, and open awareness. Philosophically, this is the soul's natural frequency when freed from interference. In other words, Yunus Emre described centuries ago what modern science now studies as self-organizing consciousness, awareness, aligning with its own intrinsic harmony. How can this insight be applied practically? Yunus Emre's teaching is not abstract. It can be experienced through methodical awareness training. Quiet the verbal mind. Spend brief moments in silence. Let internal narration soften. Neuroscience shows that even short intervals of silence reduce DMN activity and enhance interoceptive sensitivity. Shift from asking to listening. Instead of forming mental requests, focus on perceiving presence. This moves the brain from output mode to input sensitivity, improving regulation between prefrontal and limbic systems. Allow awareness to flow uninterrupted. Drop the idea of control. Let sensations and stillness appear and fade naturally. EEG studies associate such states with alpha coherence, relaxed, but alert awareness. Recognize the continuity of awareness. Notice that awareness remains even when you stop praying. This recognition that consciousness continues effortlessly is the essence of the prayer that prays itself. These steps don't require belief, only observation. They translate mysticism into direct phenomenology, verifiable by introspection and supported by modern, contemplative science. We return now to the original paradox. If prayer is something you do, what happens when it begins to happen without you? For Yunus Emre, this was not a riddle but a revelation. The truest prayer is not an act but a state of consciousness, a state in which awareness and existence are no longer separate, In cognitive language, this is the transition from the narrative self to the observing consciousness. In mystical language, it is when existence itself becomes remembrance. Every breath, every perception, every moment is prayer. Modern science calls it non-dual awareness. Yunus called it love. When the self vanishes, prayer does not end, it begins. Because what remains is not silence or absence, but pure coherence, consciousness aligned with its own source. And in that alignment, there is no I and thou. There is only the eternal act of awareness, the prayer that prays itself.